Today we'll be exploring the relationship between the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources and other mineral reporting codes, in this case the CRIRSCO family of codes. CRIRSCO, similar to UNFC, was created in the 1990s and comprises a list of standardized codes suitable for public reporting purposes, such as Canada's NI 43-101 or Australasia's JORC.
So we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Ed Sides on the podcast this week. Ed's been a member of PERC, which is the Pan-European Reserves and Resources Committee, since 2014, and he served as its chairperson from 2021 until earlier this year. He's represented PERC on the international reporting body CRIRSCO since 2020 and is currently its Deputy Chair and Chairperson-elect. He also is the founder and director of All Body Risk Limited and runs a number of training courses to upskill various individuals. So welcome, Ed.
Yeah, okay. I suppose for background, it's useful to know that I'm a geologist, resource geologist. Started my career in Ireland. I spent in Ireland. Have my mascot going just to remind people I'm from Ireland. But yeah, I started working. My career spanned exploration in Ireland and then working on projects Central America and Spain and Portugal. And then I spent the time in training and then the latter part of my career in consulting. And the last couple of years, I've sort of become involved in the professional organizations. But both CRIRSCO and UNFC, I think it's useful to know where they came from. And most people just go back 50 years with CRIRSCO, but I prefer to go back more than 100 years because some of the terms we use today, like proved reserves and probable reserves, actually originated over 100 years ago. And then in the 1950s, there were lots of discussions, different terms, and people were using the same term and different terms to mean the same thing and the same terms to mean different things. And then this all came to a head with the Poseidon bubble in around 1969, 1970 in Australia, where investors lost a lot of money in a sort of speculative shares on a company, Poseidon Nickel. And this was the time of a spike in nickel prices. And anyway, the outcome of all that was because investors lost money. The Australian regulators, are at the sort of request of the Australian regulators, some of the professional bodies set up the Joint Ore Reserves Committee, which that stands for JORC, which is the predecessor of the JORC code that people will have heard of today. And anyway, it published a series of reports, I think 1972 and 1981 and 1985. But then in 1989, it published what was the first version of the JORC codes, which is actually called a code. And then sort of in parallel with that, there was also discussions in other professional organizations around the world, and then a sort of a group called the Combined Mining and Metallurgical Institutions, which were the institutions from Australia, UK, Canada, South Africa, and the US. They came together and formed a group which was the predecessor of CRIRSCO, and it sort of subsequently their working group became known as the Combined Resources International Reserves Reporting Standards, I think. I don't know. Anyway, it was the original CRIRSCO acronym. I probably got it wrong because it all was the Combined Mineral Reserves International Reporting Committee. That's where the acronym came from. But then in 2006, they actually changed the name to the International Mineral Reserves Reporting Committee. I got the name wrong myself anyway, because the acronym stuck. So we come from CRIRSCO, but it's kind of evolved over the years, and then it's grown since it was set up in 2006, grown for 5 to 15 members, and one of those members is PERC, the Pan-European Reserves and Resources Reporting Committee, and I that's how I became involved, and then I sort of represent the Institute of Geologists of Ireland on PERC, which that's the sort of professional body for geologists in Ireland. But the others are the Geology Society in London, Institute of Mining and Metallurgy.
There's quite a complex mix of pressure over the years of people needing to hold themselves more accountable to what they're saying is in the ground. Is that correct today?
Yeah, it is. It's important to realize it's sort of aimed at ensuring that the information disclosed to investors, that's what, like in stock market jargon, you refer to issuers. Those are companies that issue shares. And then you refer to disclosure, which is the information that is disclosed to investors. And what the regulators fear are the sort of market abuse. And there are two key types of market abuse. One is insider information. So, people like a director of a company knows there's a good drill hole and tells all his family to buy shares before the investors are told of the market, and the others sort of manipulating the market by, say, pretending, using an artificially high price to say your deposit is more valuable than it really is. So that's the kind of underlying reason behind it, that the regulators, either in the listing rules or the securities legislation, will have these rules so that they protect investors. And look at the scandal in Canada, BRIEX. I mean, I found a very interesting video online which showed a Canadian pensioner and her pension fund, I think it was the Teachers' Pension Fund in Canada, had invested in this small mining company, which everyone was singing the praise that had a deposit in Indonesia, and everyone was saying it was the biggest gold deposit in the world. And that was found out to be hugely inflated due to fraudulent behavior. And, but just hearing an actual pensioner telling the story how they lost money, it's not, not necessarily someone who's invested money themselves, but, investment funds or people's pension may be invested in these things.
Yeah, BRIEX is the classic, and there's lots of stuff out there. It's really interesting. It's really interesting there. So from that perspective, we're here talking about the UNFC. So from your perspective, how does that relate to this plethora of different reporting systems or codes? Where does the UNFC fit into that? Does it fit under the umbrella, or is it a different beast in essence?
No, it's really a different system, and you need different systems for different purposes. And I've been trying to think of analogies to explain this. And I mean, both CRIRSCO, in the context we're talking, or I'm involved, we're related to mineral deposits, but it may not be specific to that. But like, if you took a sort of hypothetical example that a government wanted to, assess different, or a council wanted to assess different modes of transport, and they wanted to know things like the costs, the environmental effects, and the health benefits. So you might want to consider walking, cycling on a bike, an electric bike, a car, train, bus, airplane, but all of those are obviously very different modes of transport, and to calculate the health effects for one of them, it would be totally different. But you could imagine a high level sort of summary information which said, these are the sort of health rankings, these are the environmental impact rankings, these are the cost rankings of the different modes of transport, and you'd then have a high level aggregation system to combine them. And that's really where I see the UNFC fits in, that you still need, to give the analogy, you still need a system that deals with airplanes and their jet engines and stuff, or a different system to, analyze electric scooters and stuff, and, and so forth. So, but you could imagine compiling information at a high level. So UNFC is a high level aggregator, and then it's not only, because it started off in minerals, but it's then applied to petroleum and now geothermal. So it's been applied in lots of different sectors. And, they obviously, I would not be able to work in the oil industry or geothermal industry. I don't have the expertise. So, there's the people who are experts in mining can't transfer their skills to lots of these other sectors. But at a high level, and in this, in the case of Europe, it's at the European Commission level, they kind of want to aggregate information from a whole load of different sources and get, if you like, a dashboard type view of it.
So there's a lot of different systems and standards within that fall underneath CRIRSCO, and it's kind of the question is, do you think we need so many different systems, JORC, PERC, NO 43.1? Does those plethora of systems and standards kind of make it more complicated to then understand how UNFC fits into that? Because from a lot of the communication I feel is that, UNFC is just another one of these. From your perspective, what do you think about the variety of different systems?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit in a way that CRIRSCO itself is a high level aggregator, and what CRIRSCO, the key things CRIRSCO tries to ensure is that there are common definitions used by all those systems. So if we accept one of the codes or standards as being as a member of CRIRSCO, they have to have a CRIRSCO aligned code which uses definitions of the terms which are not significantly different. So they'll all, obviously, some of the countries have different languages and their language issues, but then they also have different legislation, the way they manage their professionals, and you're never going to get universal consensus on that, because in Canada, each province has their own regulations on engineers and geologists, and within Europe, every country has slightly different regulations. I know they try and, the European Commission, for instance, trying to get, transferability of qualifications and stuff, but you're always going to have those national and local issues. But what CRIRSCO and UNFC try to do is, provide a higher level basis where you can get a common summary for the information from all the different places, and that, like, for investors, what should be the case is that any company reporting on a CRIRSCO line system should be using the same terminology. Everyone, people need to use different methods, different commodities and things as well, but it's like I say, there's a lot of written discussion in the Institute of Mining and Metallurgy transactions from the 1950s, and you can see people were struggling with, as to what resources and reserves meant, and they were using them for the same thing. But now we have a kind of fairly clear idea in CRIRSCO and definition of what mineral resources and mineral reserves are and the distinction between them.
So, common definitions. Now, CRIRSCO obviously has them. UNFC basically has them. In fact, UNFC is trying to make common definitions for multiple resources. I feel the trick here is connecting these two systems, mapping them across. And you're a member of the CRIRSCO-UNECE task group, which has been attempting to challenge map these challenging sort of variables, values across. Can you tell me a bit about sort of the UNECE CRIRSCO task group and sort of what challenges you've had in making sure that everything is aligned as best as possible?
Well, here again, some history is useful, because if you look at the first version of UNFC from 1997, it's only applicable to solid fuels and mineral commodities, and it includes terms like mineral resources and mineral reserves. So actually, the two systems started off being very similar, and in fact, in 1999, there was a joint meeting between UNECE and the body, the CMMI working group, which was the precursor to CRIRSCO. They met jointly and agreed on common definitions in 1999, which are published in a document, UNECE document from 2000. So at that point, they were both working, covering just the same sector. But then 2004, the petroleum sector became involved with UNFC, and then obviously sort of things related to minerals, were no longer applicable. For a time, there was sort of an appendix with two sets of terminology, one for minerals and one for petroleum. And then in the petroleum industry, they use the petroleum resource management system, which is more project focused, and that's to do with the structure of the industry, and again, perhaps is more useful for government. But it's sort of changed from more an inventory type system to a project based system, and I still regard it as kind of a hybrid, because of the way it's evolved. It's really a bit of a hybrid system, and people aren't always clear which way they're really wanting to apply it. For instance, you could say, are you looking for a system that's just an inventory of mineral assets? Are you looking for a system that's an inventory of mineral projects? Or is it really a system that's an inventory of the inventories of mineral projects? So that's the challenging question I set myself, and I pose that to people, and it sort of maybe gets them thinking, well, what actually are we looking for? But but going back to the working group, maybe I didn't really, So that is to say, there were common definitions back in 2000, but then because of UNFC expanding to different sectors, they developed the framework of aligned systems and bridging documents. So something would be recognized as an aligned system if you had a bridging document which allowed you to map that system into UNFC. And that essentially is what the CRIRSCO-UNECE working group is about. It's to bridge the CRIRSCO template, which is the high-level common framework for all the CRIRSCO members. It's bridging that up to the UNFC. So if you like, we have all the different CRIRSCO codes. There you can kind of summarize in the CRIRSCO template level through the common definitions. And then there's a mapping of those to the UNFC. So you're kind of, if you like, it's a kind of a hierarchical thing, but as you go towards the top, you're aggregating information more and more. Then the UNFC is providing the highest level aggregation. And I mean, again, another thing people don't understand, or well, sort of don't fully appreciate necessarily with the UNFC, is again where it came from. But I said it came, first version was 1997, but that was based on an earlier system developed by the German Geological Survey in 1991, 1994. That was immediately post-German reunification, when obviously the German Geological Survey was having to provide information for the new, combined German government on the resources. In particular, was coal resources from former East Germany and the West Germany, and that was really where UNFC originated, trying to combine the information from two fundamentally different sort of geopolitical systems. And then if you look at the EU now, you have a lot of East European countries which are still using systems inherited from Soviet times, whereas others are familiar with the more, investor market. So it is quite a logical choice to say, well, UNFC is something that, serves the tool of reporting to the European Commission. And the use of the UNFC in the Critical Raw Materials Act is mostly to do with obligations to the national governments to report. So that allows, you're not trying to force, say, Slovakia or Bulgaria, or you have to use, PERC, or you have to use whatever. You could combine it in here. And another complexity in Europe is you have Australian, Canadian companies that are working on projects in Europe. They're obviously pulling in investment from Australia and Canada, but they're obligated to follow certain rules for their stock exchanges. So it is all quite convoluted, and again, given the global nature of mining, it does get very it can get very complex. Like I say, you can't physically move the deposits. So, a copper deposit will be in Spain or Sweden or whatever, and whatever you're doing there, you'll have to comply with the national regulation. But then if you're getting money from investors in the United States or UK or wherever, you may have to comply with the securities legislation in those. And then, again, there may be overriding EU legislation, as we have now with the Raw Materials Act, which is putting other obligations. So I don't know, probably makes it sound much more complicated, but I don't know, it is a complicated issue.
Yeah, we wanted to talk briefly about the modifying factors conversation, because we're seeing that come through in the JORC code, which is currently going through review, still going under review. I think the last draft came out a few weeks back. NF 43-101 is asking for consultation, and so that we're seeing that those kind of more sustainability kind of aspects coming into those questions. The UNFC kind of has that as one of its embedded already in it. Is that something that you see is maybe something that maybe the CRIRSCO standards can learn from, or is it something you think they're just wholly unsuitable to kind of try and join in?
It's always been there. It just depends. It's been more presented in a different way, is what I would say. Under the CRIRSCO systems, the basic idea is that you have mineral resources, which are material in the ground that's of potential economic interest. But then when you apply all the factors that have to fall in line to actually start exploiting it, that's sort of like the market price of the commodities, the costs of extracting it, the obtaining a mining permit. It's sort of community issues. Do you have to relocate roads and stuff? Getting environmental permits for the mining operation and all. So there has always been those needs there. It's just in recent years, since the sort of principles of responsible investment came in and the push on ESG, environmental social governance, there's sort of that kind of tends to be highlighted. But I think one of the problems with that is a little bit that economics has got forgotten, because again, going back to the 1997 version of UNFC, the three axes were the geological axis, the economic axis, and the feasibility axis, and there was no specific mention of environmental and social. And I'm not totally sure when that came in, but that presumably again came in because of the demands of the principles of responsible investment. So, it's questionable whether it's been tagged onto the right place. It's probably there already in the technical feasibility. It's something that you should be considering all along if you're developing a project. And I think, responsible companies, I mean, obviously the say the desires and expectations of society have changed. And I mean, but in some ways it's a little bit ironic. There's much higher. You go to places like Derbyshire and some of the old mining districts in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and they're now sort of tourist sites. But if you tried developing a new mine there'd be no way. But there is mining maybe not happening to the what I think most of the international companies that are on stock markets. There's going to be more awareness of what they're doing, even if it's not in the same country. So I think it's just societal expectations that all have changed. The CRIRSCO codes haven't fundamentally altered because of this, but we've given, like, CRIRSCO produced an ESG definitions guide to sort of make it clearer what aspects people working on mineral deposits should adhere to. And again, there's lots of discussion as to what should it be a geologist or engineer, or what's the responsibilities at the board level. And there's a lot of there are many companies have legislation on corporate governance, and again in the States, the Sarbanes-Oxley, which again you have now sustainability reporting requirements at corporate level. Once again, people working on a project level have to feed into some higher level reporting. So it's always trying to position things at the right level that you don't necessarily want me as a geologist trying to do something that it should be some board director responsibility.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge. And so some of the points you touched on there as well bring back to kind of one of the reasons why, like, a lot of us, and like myself as well, came across the UNFC, and that's the Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU. The decision for them to kind of embed UNFC into that is one of the reasons why we do that. And kind of we were keen to ask about your opinion on the strategic projects, because a lot of those have been selected by aligning with the UNFC code. We just wondered if you had any thoughts on that kind of process and how suitable it is in the EU as a system to adhere to.
Well, yeah, it's sort of an interesting question, this, because that the use of the term strategic totally depends on the context. And if you look at the list of critical minerals or critical raw materials for the EU, for the UK, for Canada, the US, they're different. There will be quite a bit of overlap, but they're not always. And it's really, one may depend on what local supply there is for into support industry, and they're usually in this policy sense, they're determined by say governmental or whatever strategies on industry, and which industries, what products do industries rely on. And I guess a lot of it comes from obviously with COVID, the global pandemic, everyone found out how dependent on efficient supply chains we are, and then that was exacerbated in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So those all have made the policymakers much more aware. Hang on, we should be a bit more aware of how vulnerable we are. And that's basically, if you're calling something critical or strategic, it's saying you kind of would be very vulnerable if you can't get supplies of that material or mineral. Then your industries may suffer, so then that's the first instance. Again, some countries will be endowed with it. May be critical for them because it's their main export product. Something that a country that has a whole lot of resources, well, like Australia and iron ore or whatever, so they may be they may be important to them in the terms of that's their export rather than their import reliance, and but then being recognised as a strategic project, I think it's sort of mixed with industry, but I'd say, if I had a mineral deposit myself, it's obviously because the intention is, if it's recognized as strategic, it will, get more attention and hopefully get speeded up. Well, the idea is it will get, more faster, more efficient permitting, but I mean, maybe we should have that anyway, and maybe it should have better, better access, better access to finance. So it's really that it will be, an added sort of tick point, or like you get a little star for being good in class. It'll be an added point, and that would obviously make it more attractive to investors and stuff. But it won't necessarily change the fundamentals of the evaluation. And I think it is very important to be using the sort of recommended good practices of the CRIRSCO professional members, because they're the bodies, they have the mining geologists and professionals who know, that the recommended ways to do things, and, ensuring, just for instance, you'd be familiar yourself with, quality control and sampling, and then the chain of custody with samples to prevent sort of fraudulent behavior.
It's almost as if we shouldn't be relying on the strategic project stamp of approval to allow you to do things quickly. You should just be being responsible and operating. The better you operate, the quicker, and we should be rewarding that rather than just having a fast track stamp, in essence, I guess.
Yeah, to an extent, but there's also, because I spent part of my career in the Iberian, working in Spain, the Iberian Pyrite Belt, and there was kind of interesting that there'd been a kind of governmental strategy you had the pyrite mines in southern Spain were obviously producing pyrite, which was for sulfuric acid, and then at that time Spain had the colonies in North Africa where they had phosphate production, and so on the coast at Huelva they set up sort of copper smelter, a byproduct which was sulfuric acid. They set up a fertilizer plant which was using the sulfuric acid and the phosphate to produce fertilizer. So they kind of had an integrated strategy which was making use of the raw materials they had to, benefit, or had access to, let's say, rather than had, maybe contentious on that. But, so I think, there would be scope, I think. Yeah, well, we're probably jumping ahead now to the kind of future, but I think one of the things that people aren't tackling is, one of the motivations is the supply chains, and the whole thing of tracking materials through the supply chains, and linking that with industrial policy is a whole area where I see there'll be a lot of attention in the future, because it's very difficult to deal with, and it's but in that sense, I guess what I'm saying, I mean, the really, there are mineral projects. There are quite a lot of known mineral projects in Europe, and then in some countries and regions, people just have a more moratorium in mining. But then people will want to be environmentally friendly, but then not realizing that the materials for their mobile phones, their cars, and everything may come from some mine in Africa, which has not been run on very good standards.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I guess that, and that's kind of one of the last things we wanted to cover on was the kind of the future, where you see the UNFC going. And as you said, these conversations have all been kind of consistently had for, what did you say, since the 1950s, just under different contexts and different premises. These kind of where the line should sit on how we should analyze and measure and define these things is constantly changing. And I guess, from the context you briefly touched on, that kind of geopolitical pressure and other things, where do you see the next real progress or steps within using UNFC or CRIRSCO to kind of more responsibly extract and access these mineral resources of the future?
Yeah, well, obviously, as I touched on, they've all evolved over time, and I think no doubt they'll continue to evolve. And I suppose it's, one shouldn't forget that the objective of both systems is to compile and present information to decision makers, and that might be company management, that might be investors, investment fund managers, or it might be government policy makers and so forth. So, I just see. I mean, they're always going to have to react to trends, but I think point I possibly haven't made strongly enough is that UNFC and the CRIRSCO systems are complementary. The UNFC, its use in the Critical Raw Materials Act, it will work much better if you see use of CRIRSCO systems as being a sort of facilitator to make it work effectively rather than a potential competitor. And likewise, I don't think people using CRIRSCO code should say, oh, now the UNFC exists, we don't need to use all the CRIRSCO stuff because it's mineral specific, whereas UNFC, is the high level aggregator. There are obviously the mineral specifications for different systems, but in a way, I think a lot of the people who are on the expert group for resource management's working group on minerals are also on some of the CRIRSCO member committees, so there's a lot of overlap there, and actually that's a lot of the same professionals. I think the one, but then, as I said, the Eastern European countries are probably more used to state mining enterprises. Now we see in the US, government taking more direct interest. So I think there will be, the geopolitical changes, probably more direct government involvement in things of the future, which will probably have implications for both systems. And then in terms of implementing the Critical Raw Materials Act, well, countries in Europe might decide to change their minerals legislation, and again, there'll probably be discussions of what systems to use, and then obviously everyone's mentioning artificial intelligence these days, so it'll probably be coming into play in terms of assessment and reporting, but there are concerns there because of the underlying algorithms that you don't have any control on, and you can see it with social media. People being forced a particular direction by an algorithm, and you'd want to, avoid that creating, or giving rise to misleading or inappropriate decisions, shall we say, because of the way things are being generated by AI. And then, I touched on the there's another aspect which I think isn't really, the Critical Raw Materials Act is very focused on targets for 2030, but then the systems aren't specifically reporting stuff on a year-by-year basis. You have to sort of, if you have a detailed feasibility study, well, you will have a production schedule and all, which will be based on a particular project concept. But I think, there'll probably be more demand by governments to actually capture some of that. But some of that information, companies may consider proprietary. So there'll kind of be a balance there. But they're probably, if they either have to make realistic assumptions of how long it's going to take a deposit to actually start operating, and then how long it'll take it to get to production capacity and so forth. And it's
18 years, I think, at the moment is the discovery to production, and that's just discovery. Yeah, so it's long. And touching on the AI point, I have seen people actually discussing, because a lot of these CRIRSCO reports, whether it's NI43 and PERC or JORC, they're consistently done. So you can train an algorithm or a system to kind of ingest lots of them, so you understand the formats and what you're going to be looking for, to put information in and come out. But then you get the whole discussion about governance, and again, like, can you hold an algorithm to account? Who's going to sign off at the end of that? At the end of the day, if it's just it's a real tricky thing. And again, does the whole CRIRSCO JORC system or NI43 need to evolve with that kind of changing demands of projects for the future, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of balance. I mean, I think the one of the philosophies at the start was that the public reports, should really be more summary for a non-technical investor. But what's tended to end up is people are dumping large technical reports. So any sort of investor who hasn't a great deal of familiarity will need someone else to interpret it for them. And I think, there we've potentially been our own worst enemy, that we're producing volumetric things rather than as the CPs summarizing and pulling out, the critical bits. And, I think I think I would tell CPs who are worried about it, well, if you do your job properly, there might not be that need, And again, I have seen lots of reports where someone, different consulting groups that worked on the same project, and you just see master content is just copied and pasted from one report to the other. Well, I don't think that's really, AI can obviously do that much quicker and cheaper than a consulting group, but so I think there will always be, I just see it as another tool. I think when I first got involved with computers, I just called it my electronic hammer, and again, if you just apply it incorrectly, you may get a chip in your eye or whatever, and may backfire on you. The same with AI. I think I think there will be, provided it's used properly. But I suppose the one concern I would have is that you don't really have any control on the underlying algorithms, and who is a competent person for deciding on the choices to do with the algorithms.
Particularly value your input from that kind of trying to reiterate that the UNFC is a complementary to CRIRSCO. And a lot of people want to crowbar it in there as can I use this or that, and it's like ultimately they go together, they're side by side, they have a purpose for various, from depending on the context. And I think in various parts of the world we talk about, everything comes back to context. So I think that's one of the real valuable takes I've taken from what you've said. So appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I suppose it's just like that. Just what you said is definitely the points that I'm really keen to get over, because I think, in the past there's kind of been a lot of, maybe misunderstanding, I think, between I think the other aspect I feel where more interaction and communication is needed is between my professionals working in industry and those in government, because I think I do get the impression some of the training I do that, people working in government departments don't necessarily properly understand, exactly the process we're going through in taking a project from exploration, evaluation through, and again, the same with academics, that they'll think, oh, you've got a nice bit of shiny rock or a bit of rock with some rare earth elements in it, they have, maybe under a misimpressed understanding, of how easy it would be to make that economic. And again, well, particularly with rare earths, I always tell people they're rare in the sense of being strange, not rare in the sense of being scarce, because there are actually lots of them around. But yeah, no, it's as I say, just that, that, as I say, the CRIRSCO systems, they're designed really to make sure that the information going to company management and investors, with greater emphasis on the financial economic aspects, are, based on a, reliable data, and have interpretations and assumptions that are, realistic and supportable. And then, whereas, the UNFC, as I said, has sort of evolved more into being, well, I think it really started off, as I said, in Germany, as an aggregation tool to sort of compile information from different sources and present to government. And so, I think there are people who say, oh no, they should have used CRIRSCO. And I mean, I perhaps would have liked a reference in the strategic projects to the CRIRSCO Alliance systems in the Critical Raw Materials Act, but I can fully understand why it's more the logical thing for the high level. Essentially the Critical Raw Materials Act is to ensure that the European Commission at the central level has a good overall perspective of what the situation is across Europe for, say, copper or whatever other metal you're interested in.
So it was a great insight from Ed, really reiterating how UNFC is complementary to CRIRSCO and reporting standards, highlighting the need for context when deciding on how to report. Next week, we're joined by Tom, who gives us a perspective from the geological surveys.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by guests or contributors on this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, Zatala, and Critical Productions. Any statements made should not be interpreted as endorsements or official positions. Listener discretion is advised.